Today is February 10, 2018, and we are in a testimony written by Ellen White called Experience Not Reliable, published in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, pages 67 to 79. Let us start, as always, with asking our Heavenly Family to help us to understand. Heavenly Family, thank you for these meetings. Thank you for the testimonies and for the principles they contain. Please help us to understand them and to apply those principles to everywhere where they do apply and to carry out the lessons in our lives as well. Please help us in our discussion tonight to advance in knowledge and to grasp what we are learning more clearly than we have earlier today or yesterday or any previous day. Thank you so much. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So, as you all know, we have been going through this testimony for a few weeks now, and the main idea that Ellen White was getting across in writing this testimony is that what people generally term experience is not reliable. Simply going through something and having a perspective on it or drawing certain conclusions from it is not actually reliable. Ellen White says that that sort of experience is the result of mere habit or indulgence, frequently and often ignorantly followed without a knowledge of the principles involved in the action. But genuine experience is knowledge derived from a variety of careful experiments. In this testimony, Ellen White contrasts true and false experience in a number of different ways. She generally characterizes false experience as being experience which is not in harmony with natural laws or with science, and genuine experience being that which is the product of experimentation and which is in harmony with natural laws and with science. So there's a lot to this, and it has been awesome having the discussions that we have been having on this topic. We have been going through the testimony in order to better understand how to recognize the difference between true and false experience in our own lives, and thus to learn to not depend on our own experience, but rather to adopt the experimental method. In addition to that, we realize, and I'm hoping when I say we, I mean everyone here, but of course it always depends on exactly where each individual is at, but I guess I'll just speak for myself. I have realized that much of the religious world is, at least to some degree, anti-scientific or holding to some sort of anti-science perspective, and that is certainly true of many, or perhaps most, Seventh-day Adventists and Davidians and Branch Davidians. And it is our purpose, or one of our purposes in going through this testimony, to see the folly of such an anti-science perspective and to really view science rightly, and that of course entails viewing it positively, because it is really a positive thing. And in this testimony, it's very interesting how Ellen White brings up science several times, and every time she speaks of it positively, but when she speaks of the religious world and how the religious world generally operates, she speaks of it quite negatively. This isn't really what I would have expected in my upbringing as a nominal Seventh-day Adventist. It's not what I would expect even when I began to really seriously study Ellen White's writings or Victor Houghton's writings. I was always within a world that, again, had at least some degree of an anti-science perspective that prevailed. And I'm hoping that that is coming to an end for all of us here on the calls. So our discussions have been great tonight. The same principle applies. Our purpose is not to just make it through this testimony. Our purpose is to understand the principles. And for that reason, if our discussion ends up taking the whole time and we don't get any further in the testimony, that is totally okay. Although, of course, last time we actually did read some more last night, and it certainly brought about some interesting discussion. And so if we get through more tonight, that's awesome. If not, that's great too. So with all that said, does anyone have any comments on this subject or any of what we've read, or kind of continuing on last night's discussion, or any questions pertinent to the subject? All right, well, since no one mentioned anything, what we'll do is continue on with what we have been reading. We are in the first paragraph of page 72 of the testimony. And what's going on here is that Ellen White is relating how these principles regarding experience don't only apply to health, they also apply to religious topics. And in fact, this is where Ellen White and those with her met the most difficulty in dealing with people in religious matters, because people would always assert their experience as being the trump card, if you will, against all other arguments. So Ellen and James and others could present factual information, and yet people would reject it because, you know, they would say things like, well, the Lord has blessed me in believing and doing as I have. So someone could present, like Ellen and James could present all the evidence that Sunday sacredness is not scriptural, and that the move away from the Sabbath is something that took place in the post-apostolic era, and someone might become aware of all that factual information and yet say, well, God led me to this church, or, well, God designed that I would be born into this family and to be in this other church, and, you know, we keep Sunday and God has blessed us in doing this, so that's what we're going to do. And just discard the factual information. That's just to give an example. Now, beyond that, in the paragraph that we are actually reading, Ellen White uses the story of Adam and Eve to make a point that is a point that I have never heard anyone make with the story of Adam and Eve until reading this testimony. And what she is pointing out is that Eve was depending upon her own experience, and her experience, by means of her testimony of it, had a great influence on Adam, and he went according to her experience as well, and obviously it did not end up well. It brought about the fall, as it is called. And in fact, I'll read some of this again. I might actually just start back at the beginning of the paragraph, and then we'll continue on discussion. The Lord made man upright in the beginning. He was created with a perfectly balanced mind, the size and strength of all its organs being perfectly developed. Adam was a perfect type of man. Every quality of mind was well proportioned, each having a distinctive office, and yet all dependent, one upon another, for the full and proper use of any one of them. Adam and Eve were permitted to eat of all the trees in the garden, save one. The Lord said to the holy pair, In the day that ye eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, ye shall surely die. Eve was beguiled by the serpent to believe that God would not do as he said he would. Ye shall not surely die, said the serpent. Eve ate and imagined that she felt the sensations of a new and more exalted life. She bore the fruit to her husband, and that which had an overpowering influence upon him was her experience. The serpent had said that she should not die, and she felt no ill effects from the fruit, nothing which could be interpreted to mean death, but just as the serpent had said, a pleasurable sensation, which she imagined was as the angels felt. Her experience stood arrayed against the positive command of Jehovah, and Adam permitted himself to be seduced by the experience of his wife. Thus it is with the religious world generally. Now, that's where we stopped last night. And again, to highlight the major points, Eve went on her experience. She felt a sensation that the food was good, and she reported that experience to Adam, and he went with it. Anyone who believes in Genesis chapters 2 and 3 would not say that that experience was a genuine experience. They would say that they were deceived by that experience. In fact, anyone who acknowledges the existence of deception has to acknowledge that there is a such thing as false experience. That what we may be led to believe to be true by our senses and by our perception of the world around us may in fact be false. That's something very serious to consider. And Ellen White is pointing out here that this dependence upon experience and being seduced by the experience of others is generally how things operate in the religious world. And I think we can all see that that's true. Religious people are not generally interested in fact, in actually believing only what can be shown to be true. People are interested in hearing stories which confirm their own biases and going with that. And this happens all the time. in churches, in religious groups, if anyone comes with a testimony that confirms the belief of the religious group, everyone's going to accept it. If someone has some scientific finding that is claimed to prove the existence of God or the immaterial soul or whatever it may be, everyone will accept that. But if someone comes with a scientific finding that disconfirms the bias, it's so easily discarded, and in come the flood of conspiracy theories and misconceptions and misrepresentations in order to justify the rejection of scientific fact. So that is really how it is with the religious world generally. And also, of course, if a scientific finding comes along, or a supposed scientific finding, which confirms a unique doctrine of another religion, people won't accept that either. People will only accept things which confirm their own beliefs and reject anything which disconfirms them or which confirms a belief which is contrary to theirs. To put this bluntly, that is dishonest. And all of us who have done that have engaged in a certain degree of dishonesty, perhaps without even realizing it. But if we hold double standards and will accept A, B, C, but not D, because A, B, C confirms our bias, but D doesn't, we are being dishonest with the facts. So that's something we always have to make sure to be aware of and to keep our biases in check, and better than that, being rid of our biases. Continuing with the statement from Ellen White, God's express commands are transgressed, and because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. In the face of the most positive commands of God, men and women will follow their own inclinations and then dare to pray over the matter, to prevail upon God to consent to allow them to go contrary to his expressed will. The Lord is not pleased with such prayers. Satan comes to the side of such persons as he did to Eve in Eden and impresses them, and they have an exercise of mind, and this they relate as a most wonderful experience which the Lord has given them. I just want to point out here that this sort of thing is so very common. And, often people think it's always right to pray about something. No, it is not always right to pray about something. And it's not always right to ask God whether something is actually true if you have already had the evidence presented to you concerning it, and it's enough evidence to confirm it. So Ellen White talks about this elsewhere, specifically in regard to the Sabbath, and a woman wondering if she should keep the Sabbath. And she had all the information presented, and then she goes back to God and, should I keep the Sabbath? Should I keep the Sabbath? Show me whether the Sabbath is true. Okay, here's all the evidence. Okay, show me whether the Sabbath is true. Okay, well, if I ask any of you guys a question, and you give me the answer, and you provide the evidence for it, and then I just ask you the same question again, you won't feel as though you're being heard because you won't really be heard. If I really was listening and cared about what you had to say, I wouldn't ask you the same question over and over again if you're actually answering it.
And what's the point in answering you again with the same answer? You're just going to ignore it again.
Precisely. And this is why, in circumstances such as that, our Heavenly Family can't say anything else. So the devil steps in, and he can mislead people then. And then Ellen White points out they have an exercise of mind, and, now they start saying things like, well, the Holy Spirit spoke to me, and, I just need to stay where I am right now. Or, maybe that's good for some people, but I just need to do it like this. No, that's not how people think, like that they can kind of control God or use God to get whatever they think is right. And in reality, our Heavenly Family is not interested in that. Our Heavenly Family is interested in truth, and they're interested in helping people. But they're not interested in gratifying people's perverted appetites or in leading people to get to do what they want to do. People often think that we should really figure out what we want and then pray for that. That's not how it works. No. It's not about what we want. It's about what is right and what is true. So, anyway, continuing with what Ellen White says here. A true experience will be in perfect harmony with natural and divine law. Divine law here is referring to moral law, as Ellen White had said already earlier. It's interesting how she keeps on repeating this. This is at least the third time where she's repeated this whole thing of in harmony with natural law. False experience will array itself against science and the principles of Jehovah.
Interesting how she's relating those two as almost one and the same.
By that, do you mean like science and natural law being the same and divine law and the principles of Jehovah being the same? Or what do you mean?
That wasn't what I had in mind, actually, and maybe I'm viewing it wrongly, but false experience will array itself against science and the principles of Jehovah. I was taking that to mean that the principles of Jehovah are as science.
Well, that's true as well. I don't think that that's what Ellen White is emphasizing in any sort of like exact way, but she's definitely putting them on the same side together, that they are together, they work together. Sure. And
when you compare the sentence prior, I mean, it makes more sense that she's restating her sentence in a new way, one being a positive declaration and one being a negative declaration. Here's true experience and here's false experience. So she's basically saying the same thing in opposite ways. So true experience, perfect harmony with natural and divine law. False experience will array itself against science or natural law and principles of Jehovah, divine law.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, again, false experience arrays itself against science.
That's pretty big for people who, profess belief in the inspiration of Ellen White and the message of Adventism, and present truth as well. and are, have a negative view of science.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, here's something that I want to mention just in terms of principle. And I don't remember where this is. I've read up on it in the past, but it has been quite some time ago now. But there are certain statements that Ellen White made at certain points that reflect the scientific understanding of her day, but which has now been shown to be incorrect. So Ellen White, in one place, expressed something about how volcanoes work. And her understanding of volcanoes was later shown to be incorrect. Like, sure, it was the understanding of her day, but now we've learned more about volcanoes, and it turns out that it's another way. So what do you do in a circumstance like that? What what statement do you go with? Because, people get into Ellen White quote battles, right? Mm-hmm. So someone might argue that, no, this is how volcanoes work because Ellen White said so, and she was a prophet. And for you to reject that is to, blaspheme the Holy Spirit and reject Ellen White. And then someone could reply and say, well, she says that true experience is in harmony with science and so on. And then they could say, well, yeah, she says that, but obviously the true experience and the true science shows that volcanoes operate like this, because this is how Ellen White said that volcanoes operate. Okay, but then it conflicts with science again. So which statement do you go with in a circumstance like that? I'm sure there could be other examples found in Ellen White's statements about health, because she was going with the common understanding of her day. Victor Houghton gave an example in Entering Wedge of some of Ellen White's negative comments in regard to dairy and eggs, and how later she actually said, well, we don't have a burden on this anymore, and if we are to give up eggs and dairy at some point, God will show us. And Victor Houghton pointed out that the reason for this was a change in what specialists in her day were saying. Some specialists earlier on were saying that, eggs and dairy are injurious to health. So Ellen White was repeating that information. And then more information came out that said, no, actually, you know what? They don't seem to be injurious to health. So then the position was, okay, well, hey, let's not make this a big deal because, there doesn't seem to be an issue here. And if it is an issue at some point, then we'll deal with it then. So that's just another example of a statement that Ellen White could make. And again, you could come to this conflict where someone could quote a statement from Ellen White like this concerning science and how genuine experience is always in harmony with science. And then someone else could say, well, yeah, but you can't throw away this Ellen White statement where she says something negative about eggs. And so obviously true science, my way of harmonizing it, someone might say, is that true science must say that eggs are bad, even if science today doesn't say that. That must not be true science.
True science will catch up with what Ellen White said eventually.
Right. Okay, so
they claim that true science has caught up with some of the things Ellen White said.
Right. So here's the thing. When we come to something like this, whether it's eggs or volcanoes or any other thing, if we come to something in the writings of Ellen White or in the writings of any other messenger which actually conflicts with science and natural law, what do we do? Which statement takes precedence, if you will? Is it the specific statement in regard to the specific thing, or is it the statement which underlines this principle about genuine experience. What do you guys think?
Well, obviously, it's the principle of, science takes precedence. Science of the day takes precedence over Ellen White's understanding of science of her day.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Absolutely. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. It would have to be that way, right? I mean, just like you said, it's the principle. The principle has to take precedence. The specifics are less important. It really comes to the principle because that's what guides the understanding. In fact, Ellen White, what she had to say about volcanoes was based on the science of her day, not the science of the previous day. Same as her comments on any other subject that relates to science. It was based on the science of her day rather than the science of previous days. Ellen White probably had a slightly more accurate understanding of embryology than did Isaiah. And she wasn't going to go with Isaiah's understanding just because Isaiah had that understanding. No, because knowledge advances and we must advance with it. So this is just something very important to keep in mind, that we shouldn't take these other statements and views of messengers in the past or in the present. And so, whoever the messenger is, we shouldn't take their specific views on science, whether it's my views on science or Ellen White's views or Paul's views or Jesus' views or Isaiah's views or Moses' views, whatever. No, we can't just take their views on whatever, volcanoes or health or the way the world works, and just say that, oh, that's what it is. And we just go with that because they're messengers when that's not even what their messages were about, and use that against what science today has found. No, the responsible thing to do, and the thing to do which is in harmony with the counsel in this testimony, is to go with the best available science in our day above the understanding of past messengers or a present messenger. Because you know what? There may be things that I think are one way because of the world in which I live and my upbringing and all of that. And some of those views may be contrary to science. That could very well be the case. And I don't know enough about science on tons of subjects to be able to say one way or the other. And some of you may know more on those subjects than I do and may have a more accurate view of reality in that regard. And that's great. And that's why we can all learn from each other. And then I can learn from, whoever among you on that particular issue. And no one should say, oh, well, Trent or someone else said this and it happened to relate to geography, and so that must be right. No, that's not how it works. We have to really go with the best available information of our day. And I love these statements from Ellen White because they deal with principles so directly, and we need to settle into these principles. These are the sorts of statements which we must never discard. There are statements made by messengers, as Doug so well pointed out in Holy Cow, Holy Dung. God's messengers do make statements which we must pass off, which we must discard at some point because they are on subjects upon which they have no special light or whatever, and no one's infallible. We all have imperfect views. But when it comes to these principles that God has inspired messengers to understand and advocate, these are things Like, this is the message. This is the bedrock. And these are the sorts of things that we need to not discard. People often flip it, and they hold on to these specific statements and discard the principles when we need to hold on to the principles, because that's what guides us to all truth.
You know, when you said knowledge advances, with that Silver Trumpet meeting I just had Wednesday, for those that weren't on there, that's a perfect example of how knowledge advances. And I was just pointing out to everybody that was on the call, you know, we were in Silver Trumpet, and the topic was in the question and answer section about whether we should consume oils, right? And so that was a perfect, like I said, perfect example of showing how fast knowledge advances, where because we now know about the documentary hypothesis, we all are now learning about science-based medicine is where we need to lean on, et cetera, that I was pointing out that you had written that in 2015, where now, 2018, just last week, or no, just, you know, a couple days ago, we couldn't go by that anymore because of advancement in our knowledge, that some of those statements were no longer valid, right? If you want to make a comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the specifics of that circumstance, you know, question, should we consume oils? Okay, so the first part of the answer that I wrote to that, I quoted a statement from Victor Hodoff in Entering Wedge Part 2, where he talks about the Bible being the ultimate health authority. And then I proceeded to quote a bunch of statements from the Bible which speak of oil as a good food. Okay, well, that is assuming the same thing that Victor Hodoff assumed, which again, so that's not something unique to me, nor was it unique to Victor Hodoff, because the idea is, oh, well, the Bible, what it advocates in regard to these things must be true because it's the Bible, and so that's just the way it works, right? Because everyone thinks that the Bible is just totally right in all of the perspectives put forward by it. So I made comments based off of this idea expressed in Entering Wedge 2, and now we've learned that, hey, wait a second, there's a few problems with that, because that is not taking into consideration the fact that the Bible is just a collection of books, not all of which even claim inspiration, and also even writings which are a product of inspiration do not necessarily contain accurate information on health. So, you know, we talked about that in a recent call, but this is just a perfect example to show how, look, the statements that I made in answer to that question are far from perfect. None of us could see that at the time because we didn't understand some of the principles that we understand now. So now, in light of the principles that we understand, I have to look on past statements, or even, I'll give another example, I have definitely made statements in the past that implied that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. You know, I would say things or even write things like, you know, well, according to Moses, then I'd quote something from the Pentateuch. Well, is that correct? No, that is not correct. You know, just like the idea that one can justifiably assert the correctness of consuming oils on the basis of passages from Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. You know, that's not actually a good reason to consume oils, because that is not actually where we should go to get our health advice. So with all of that in mind, this just shows us that we cannot depend on what we've learned in the past or what we grew up thinking or whatever. We have to depend on what can be shown to be true according to the best information available to us now. And if we do that, even if the best finding of science at the present time are later discovered to be inaccurate to some degree, then at that time we have to revise our position. And this is actually the way that science works. Scientific conclusions are provisional. They are subject to change based on further information. This is the same way that it works, by the way, with the advancement of present truth. Mm-hmm. And also in science, the way it works too is that it usually does not happen that someone comes along in science and totally overturns a previously established scientific perspective. Now, other perspectives are totally overturned at times, but usually it's not something that has been founded by modern science. Within modern science, usually someone comes and builds on previous ideas and shows how they're inaccurate. There's a talk somewhere by a physicist named Lawrence Krauss where he describes major scientific advancements and how often they are arrived at by a synthesis of two previously different or differing conclusions in science, or findings. So, science learned about electricity, and science learned about magnetism. And then science found that, actually viewing electricity as had been viewed and viewing magnetism as had been viewed is right to a point, but really, to view it rightly, we have to understand that they are really the same phenomenon in different contexts, and thus we must now describe it as electromagnetism. Oh, science has something to say about space. Science has something to say about time. Actually, we come to find out that they are actually really part of the same thing. And so scientists now refer to space-time. There's lots of examples of that sort of thing. Different things which at one point seem to be different things, or sometimes even seeming to be at odds with each other, are brought together to be the same thing. And in the process, certain conceptions from the past understanding have to be corrected, or you discover the limits of certain things. Oh, that's the same with the advancement of present truth. Victor Houghton didn't come along and say, hey, the unique things that Ellen White brought forward are wrong. Here's the new message. No, new truth is never independent of the old, whether, again, in the messages regarding morality or in science. Rather, Victor Houghton said, this understanding is correct. And what naturally follows from that? Oh, the investigative judgment for the dead. The investigative judgment for the living. And here is what it's about. And in doing so, yes, there were some understandings that Ellen White had that Victor Houghton had to explain, hey, these understandings that she had and that we've all had are not correct. And so we need to correct those things. So like Ellen White clearly believed that the kingdom would not be established until the second coming of Christ. Well, in light of the new understanding of the judgment for the living, which actually is building on the main teaching of Ellen White, in light of a further understanding of that very teaching, it had to be understood that there is to be a kingdom set up prior to the millennium here on earth. So that is just illustrating that the principles that are at work with the messages in regard to morality that our Heavenly Family has sent, and the principles that work in science are actually the same principles. Both advance, and both advance in the same way. In both, corrections are made to previous understandings, but it is always on relatively minor points or upon points which were not actually arrived at due to the findings of the scientists or the messengers in their respective contexts. And in both fields, advancement is made by building upon the principles of the previous specialists, I guess is the way to put it. So anyway, I hope that was a helpful comment in addition to what you had to say, Anna, and I guess going beyond that to some extent. So are there any other comments or questions on the point that we're at, or are you guys ready for us to continue on through the rest of this paragraph?
Continue, please.
All right, excellent. Okay, so I'll read the last two sentences again. A true experience will be in perfect harmony with natural and divine law. False experience will array itself against science and against the principles of Jehovah. The religious world is covered with a pall of moral darkness. Superstition and bigotry control the minds of men and women and blind their judgment, so that they do not discern their duty to their fellow men and their duty to yield unquestioned obedience to the will of God. Okay, so let's go back and comment on some of these things. The religious world is covered with a pall of moral darkness. So, in essence, people are not following an experimental way of discovering morality and of getting rid of immorality. That's the implication here. The implication to these statements regarding experience and how she applies it to science and to the principles of Jehovah. Natural law and divine law. The implication is that genuine experience as it relates to both things is the same. And false experience in relation to both things is the same. So genuine experience is experimentally founded and grounded. False experience is not built upon experimentation. It is rather based on superstition and bigotry and bias and dependence upon our own experience. So really what that shows us, the fact that these two things are the same, is that Ellen White is saying that just like science needs to be based on experiment, just so does our understanding of morality. So she's really advocating a truth-based moral system, just like we've been advocating in this message.
Something that comes to my mind in relation to the sentence, the religious world is covered with a pall of moral darkness. I'm reminded that this isn't too long after the Civil War, and that was just so disgusting that so-called religious people were using God as their reason for treating their fellow human beings in such a disgusting manner. Like, talk about a pall of moral darkness. It just turns my stomach thinking about it. Anyway, that's all I want to say.
Absolutely. See, that's a great example, by the way, of, okay, well, what are we going to do? What's our experience? Well, my experience is that, and I'm not speaking for myself here. I'm just speaking the voice of someone with a false experience. Someone may have said, well, my experience is that the Bible is the inspired, infallible Word of God, and here in the Bible, right here in Leviticus 25, and right here in Exodus 21, God says that you can perpetually own slaves, and you can beat them so long as they don't die, and, all these different things. So, I mean, that's good. That's a good thing. And actually, people did argue for this on the basis of those passages and on the basis of history and how other so-called great men had slaves, and people would justify this because of the Bible and because of past experiences of other people. I mean, that's not an experimental moral system, that's for sure. That's depending on false experience. And, of course, Ellen White was very much so opposed to slavery and to racism and all of that.
That's the danger of getting your morality from an authority rather than from reality.
Amen.
Before you go further, I had listened to someone talking about Ellen White and her comments about slavery, and of course you pointed out how you could be dogmatic and how the Bible seemingly, promoted it, and what did Ellen White say in regard to it? I mean, I know that she was against slavery, and how did she explain that without going necessarily against the Bible? Because I don't think that she even had really the understanding that that the canon was not an inspired idea, or she at least didn't really promote that it wasn't an inspired idea. Do you know the answer to that?
Well, this is a very interesting question. And, okay, so those two passages in the Bible, the one in Exodus 21 and the one in Leviticus 25, do absolutely promote slavery. And then they promote perpetual slavery. They promote owning other human beings as property, and you can pass them on to your children as inheritance for perpetual generations, forever and ever. And that you can beat them so long as they do not die within 2 or 3 days. And if you beat them and they don't die, you should not be punished because they are your property. That's what it says in these passages. And so I looked up at some point everything that I could find in Ellen White's writings and in the writings of early Adventist pioneers in relation to these passages. And I didn't find anything. I have never been able to find any comment by any Adventist pioneer or Ellen White herself on these passages. And maybe the reason why is because they had no clue what to say in response to them. And
but they just knew that is not right, and I'm not going with that no matter what.
Right. So when I first read these passages with my eyes open to actually see what they say rather than just being glazed over by the darkening, I don't even know the right word, but the darkening influence of canonical thinking. When I was first able to read these passages and recognize, wow, that's what that says? I didn't know what to think. And so my first thought was, okay, I'm going to look up all of the textual variants. I'm going to look up everything on this, all the translations, and find out what this actually says. Like, does this actually say what this, at least the translation that I'm reading, what this says? So with both passages, I looked at every textual witness, I looked at every translation, I looked up the key words in it to find out, like, what could this be? Could this be anything else? And everything, like every bit of information that I was finding, just showed that these passages do indeed promote slavery and do indeed promote, like, there is no
getting around it.
Yeah, there's no way to get around it. Like, you can't. There is no textual variant that doesn't promote slavery. There is no anything, no way to translate it accurately, which does not promote slavery. There's just no way around it.
And not just slavery, but physically beating your slave. You know, because people want to say, oh, but the slave, that wasn't the same kind of slavery.
Right.
That they were like family.
Yeah.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, that's not true.
No.
And, and I guess, to be clear, that one passage does not specifically promote, like, it doesn't say you should beat your slave or you shall beat your slave, but it justifies it. It allows it. It says that you shouldn't be punished if you do it because they're your property. So, like, in a way, it's just, like, totally endorsing it. And it's just like, oh, man. So, but anyway, before I had completed that investigation of the textual variants, the translations, and all of that, I didn't know what to think of it. But all I did know is that no matter what, I'm not going to promote slavery, even if this passage does. That's all I knew. All I knew is that no matter what it means, I was like, even if that's what this passage says, and even if those are really the words of Moses, and even if it means that Moses was a false prophet, and even if that meant that Jesus is a false prophet, and, whatever, down the line, I was like, no matter what it means, all I know is that I am not going to promote slavery. I was like, I'm not going to justify this if it's really promoting something evil. And so, I ended up finding that those passages really are promoting something evil. And, of course, I found out that Moses didn't write that stuff anyway. So, the Moses thing doesn't become an issue with that then. But even so, here are these passages that we have in, quote-unquote, the Bible, which so many people accept to be the Word of God. And, so I can't really say what Ellen White actually thought of these passages or what other Adventist pioneers thought because they never commented on it. But I can at least relate to, like, even if they did kind of understand it, I can imagine how they would still be opposed to racism and slavery, even without really knowing how to understand those passages, because I've been in that place where I didn't really know what to think of those passages, and yet I knew what my stand had to be on slavery. So, anyway, hopefully that's helpful in some way.
No, it is. I remember, the preacher said, basically what Teresa had said, just kind of indicating that Ellen White was like, this is just wrong, and we're not doing this, and I just thought that was really cool. Definitely inspired, because I'm sure a lot of preachers would have just, gone the dogmatic route, and, so I don't know. It's just inspired and very awesome.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's see where we're at here. Okay, superstition and bigotry control the minds of men and women and blind their judgment so that they do not discern their duty to their fellow men and their duty to yield unquestioned obedience to the will of God. Okay, so we have two aspects here.
I just find that statement really interesting in light of our discussion we just had on slavery and what Ellen White thought of those verses in the Bible.
Right.
Let's see. Yielding unquestioned obedience to the will of God. Well, she evidently didn't think that was the will of God. And obviously, I know she didn't. She said as much.
Oh, yeah.
But that I find very, very interesting in light of our discussion.
Right. So this is the thing that people often confuse. And when people read statements like this from Ellen White, especially the last portion, and we'll deal with that first because that's the one that could be the greatest stumbling block for someone, I suppose, or at least has the greatest possibility of coming off as a contradiction of what she's saying through this whole testimony. Okay, so yielding unquestioned obedience to the will of God. People take some of these sorts of statements from Ellen White where there are several statements where she says something like unquestioning obedience or unquestioned obedience, things like that. You could do a search through Ellen White's writings and find her using a phrase like that in many instances. And people misrepresent what Ellen White says when she uses phrases like this as though she's saying that we should dogmatically or ignorantly even, without really questioning or using reason or whatever, we should just follow whatever we're told in our theology or whatever we believe God has said or whatever. Now, that's not actually what she's saying here. Notice, in order to go to the step of like, okay, let's just take the slave master argument and, oh, well, this is what the Bible says, this is the will of God, let's just do that. Okay, well, Ellen White obviously was operating differently from that. So what's the difference? The difference is that Ellen White is advocating a different method for discovering the will of God.
Mm-hmm.
Ellen White is not saying that we shouldn't question what the will of God is. She's saying that when we discover the Word of God, we should yield unquestioned obedience to the will of God. Now, that's not saying that you should not question what constitutes the will of God. Obviously, Ellen White was opposed to people believing, oh, well, the will of God must be to own slaves because these passages, whatever. No, Ellen White wasn't for that. Ellen White was for questioning what constitutes the will of God. And there's a statement Ellen White makes where she says that God does not require anyone to believe something without sufficient evidence. We read it in our discussions on this very testimony. So that's really a big difference. So Ellen White here describes two different methods, one of false experience and one of true experience. True experience is experimentally grounded. False experience is not experimentally grounded. Ellen White is describing the principles of Jehovah as being in harmony with science and in harmony with natural law. And to discover the will of God is not different from discovering what is in harmony with science and what is in harmony with natural law. She's clearly portraying those two things as being on the same side. That said, Ellen White, and by the way, I have to point out that in this context, where she says to yield unquestioned obedience to the will of Jehovah, think about the context that she's talking about here. She's talking about, like earlier in the paragraph, she says, in the face of the most positive commands of God, men and women will follow their own inclinations and then dare to pray over the matter, to prevail upon God, to consent to allow them to go contrary to his expressed will. Okay, so what's the principle here? What is Ellen White objecting to? People learning the factual information and then following their own inclinations in spite of that. So that's the type of questioning that she's talking about that she is saying we should not do. The type of questioning is in spite of all the evidence, oh, well, maybe that's not valid. Maybe I'm going to go with my own inclination. Obviously, people wouldn't phrase it like that in their own thought process, but that's in principle what she's getting at. People getting the factual information and then continuing to question it in spite of the evidence, not honest questioning in order to discover what the evidence shows to be true. Ellen White is promoting for us to question things to discover what the evidence shows to be true. She is discouraging us from questioning the evidence on the basis that it contradicts our own inclinations. So when she's saying to yield unquestioned obedience to the will of God, she's clearly describing, hey, go with the evidence, just like she was saying to yield our own judgment on health and to go with the opinions of the health experts. This is what she said earlier in the testimony, speaking to Sister N, and she was telling her not to rely upon her experience, but to go with the experience of the physicians at the Health Institute because they know better. They have genuine experience in this. Ellen White is viewing God here as being the expert when it comes to morality. God is the moral authority, just like science-based physicians are the health authorities. Now, God being the moral authority does not mean that God was the originator of morality or that God decides morality, no more than the health authorities are the originators of health or are the people who make something to be healthy. Well, let's choose that broccoli is going to be healthy and that candy is not going to be healthy. No one made that decision. People discover those realities, just so God discovers moral realities and communicates them to people. That's how God is the moral authority. No different from scientists being authorities in their respective fields. So when someone has a moral inclination or an inclination to do a certain thing that has moral consequences, but that is contrary to the express will of Jehovah, as can be experimentally verified, they are to yield their judgment in a harmony with that. This is actually the same principle that Ellen White advocates in Testimonies 5 in a section called How to Receive Reproof. And in that passage, she also explains how people will discard the reproof that our Heavenly Family, well, she says God, that God gives them because it conflicts with their biases, and how that should not be done. That even if we cannot see that we should be reproved on something, we should accept the reproof. Why? Because our experience is not reliable. And the data shows that, I'll just say with Ellen White's instance, the evidence shows that she is really a messenger of God and that she has a true moral message. And therefore, if she was to correct someone and someone couldn't quite see it because their biases are getting involved, they should yield their judgment and go with what she had to say on that issue, because that's where the evidence pointed. And they shouldn't depend on their own experience in that regard. I do recommend for everyone, especially if you haven't seen it, but even if you've seen it, it'd be great to go back to it again. On the Timeless Testimonies YouTube channel, Teresa has a video where she goes through how to receive reproof. And I believe that the title of the video is simply How to Receive Reproof, along with the specifications of, like, you know, which video it is in the series of videos as part of the nature and influence of the testimonies. But it's called How to Receive Reproof. And in that video, Teresa goes through that testimony of Ellen White, and if it wouldn't be plain to anyone just reading it, which I think it should be, definitely Teresa's discussion of it lays out the principles very, very clearly. So I really do recommend that to everyone here.
It's the 13th video in the series.
Okay, 13th video. So NIT 13, How to Receive Reproof. So you guys can look that up. So that's the first issue here. Superstition and bigotry, I don't know if we need to really comment on that too much, since maybe it's already obvious to everyone. And plus, Ellen White made the comment earlier about superstition arising from a diseased imagination often arrays itself against scientific principles. You know, that's the same sort of thing that's going on here. And people, by means of this, end up not discerning their duty. Ellen White is dealing with the implications, the fact that depending on our false experience leads to detrimental effects in regard to how we deal with our fellow human beings and how we deal with our heavenly family. So, pretty serious issues. We have been on now for an hour and 15 minutes, so we should bring an end to the meeting. Does anyone have any last comments or questions?
I have something short to add. In the Ellen White CD-ROM, I did a quick search for the phrase unquestioning obedience or unquestioned obedience. So I did quotations, unquestioned, asterisk, obedience, end quotation. And it came up with like 50-some hits. Most of them are repetition because they're in devotionals, and it's, you know, just a few core original statements. But in browsing, I discovered a Review and Herald article that predates the testimony that we're reading, but has much of the same information, a lot shorter. And I'm pretty sure it predates the information, maybe not by much. It says July 27, 1886. And I think, well, I don't remember what year Testimonies Volume 3 was written. But anyway, the purpose isn't for me to say which one came first necessarily. It's just that there's some, many parallels here, but there's a few differences, I think. And some of the differences, are the most obvious one is that it's not being written to an individual. But the article just after that, August 3, 1886, Known by Their Fruits, that caught my eye because of the series of testimonies I went through from the nature and influence of the testimonies. There's one, To Be Known by Their Fruits. And as I was skimming through this, the very end of that was just something that I thought, man, I want to share this real quick because, you know, as we're reading Experience Not Reliable, and it's emphasizing the need to be in harmony with science and the laws of nature and the laws of God, it shows that having knowledge of the laws of nature is important. To be educated, in other words. And in this article in the Review and Herald, Known by Their Fruits, she's emphasizing how important it is for us to be of such character and mannerism as to not be offensive and disgusting to the rest of the world. She talks about how the world views Sabbath keepers or Adventists as lowly and just degraded and, okay, here she says, we as a people are not understood. We are looked upon as degraded and are accounted as poor, weak-minded, and low. Then how important for all those who teach and all who believe the truth to be so affected by its sanctifying influence as to show unbelievers by their consistent elevated lives that they have been deceived in this people. How important that the cause of truth be stripped of everything like a false and fanatical excitement, that the truth may stand upon its own merits, revealing its native purity and exalted character. So she continues to talk about those principles, and she ends like this. She talks about how if a Christian is hated because of his good works for following Christ, he will have a reward. But if he's hated because he does not take a course to be loved, hated because of his uncultivated manners, and because he makes the truth a matter of quarrel with his neighbors, and because he has taken a course to make the Sabbath as annoying as possible to them, he is a stumbling block to sinners, a reproach to the sacred truth, and unless he repents, it were better for him that a millstone were hung about his neck and he cast into the sea. No occasion should be given to unbelievers to reproach our faith. We are considered odd and singular and should not take any course to lead unbelievers to think us more so than our faith requires us to be. So there's more to this. She talks about how people will act independent of the body and they will believe and act as they choose, even though they have the truth presented to them, et cetera, et cetera. And as I was considering the testimony experience not reliable and how we're being counseled to be in accordance with science, one of the reasons today why religious people are mocked and ridiculed and not even taken seriously by the higher educated is because there's no acknowledgement of science as valid and governing. And as a general rule, myself in the past included, there's been pride taken in this lack of education. And we need to stop that. We need to be educated. We need to promote education. We need to cultivate our manners and our knowledge and promote the truth. Because if we continue to promote falsehood in any areas of life, we're just going to be completely discredited in the eyes of the world on other points related to, just, I hesitate to say morality, but, just matters that require a complete surrender to selfishness and sin, because even though the world is way ahead of religious people in regard to acknowledging science and the laws of reality there, it's still generally regarded as whatever makes you happy is okay to do. So long as you don't, physically hurt another person, you can't go out and kill people, that sort of thing. They have good moral standards on a lot of levels, but it's just kind of like, just for your own sake, just whatever makes you happy.
Yeah, selfishness is still promoted, and it's still not a thought that we can actually get rid of it. Right.
So that's what the world needs, is to wake up to the fact that selfishness isn't okay in any regard, but they're not going to listen to any of us if we come across as
ignorant, bigoted. Yeah.
So just wanted to share that. This is Review and Herald, 1851, and that was from August 3, 1886, known by their fruits.
Excellent. So I just wanted to point out as well that this testimony in Testimonies Volume 3 that contains experience not reliable, it's Testimony 21, which was published in 1872.
Okay.
So this one is earlier than that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad that you found another place which contains this content, or at least some of it, because that section in Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 109, is awesome, and it's parallel to this in Testimonies 3, Experience Not Reliable. But it's a much shorter section. Some of what it says is expressed slightly different than it is here, and both are so valuable. So I could imagine another parallel having differences that are likewise valuable.
Yeah, it's there for sure.
That is awesome. I look forward to reading that. Okay. Well, our 5-minute reminder just went off, so our phone will cut out here.
I'd be happy to pray unless someone has a last comment.
Well, I don't think we have time for more comments tonight. I was just going to ask if anyone wanted to pray, and if you want to, that's totally fine.
Yeah,
so,
I'd love to.
Let's do that.
Heavenly Family, I want to thank you again for striving with us and educating us and showing us the importance of education. And I'm just really grateful that you don't want a people that's just ignorant and backwards and, that isn't able to gain a true education. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for encouraging us to move forward unitedly, and thank you for guiding us at a pace that we can keep up with too. So please encourage each one of us. Give us wisdom as we seek to correct our misunderstandings and to advance in the knowledge of reality and truth and love, and help us to change the world. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen. All right, well, I look forward to us continuing this subject next weekend, and blessings to you all. Shalom.
Shalom.
Night.